On the surface, this is a story about a tragedy. A beloved third-grade teacher finds her husband dead, an apparent suicide. But when you start to peel back the layers, you find a story so full of contradictions, it would take investigators nearly 5 years to sort it all out. This is a story about a distraught wife, a suspiciously clean steak knife, and a timeline that just doesn't make any scientific sense.
When the first police officers arrived at the home of Heather and Robert Hoyer, their body cams were rolling. And this is what they heard. Not a frantic cry for help, not an explanation of what happened, but this strange repeated phrase, "I failed." Right from the start, things just weren't adding up. And that, right there, became the central question of this entire investigation. Did she fail to save the man she loved, or did she fail to cover up what she'd done? So let's go back to the beginning. The official story starts at 5:40 in the morning with a 911 call. Heather tells the dispatcher she'd been sleeping on the couch, and when she went into the bedroom, she found her husband Robert on the floor. He was cold. She said that earlier in the night, he'd been complaining about chest pains. But here's what immediately felt off to the officers. Heather claimed that Robert had admitted to using a steak knife on himself. But her reaction to seeing what were clearly fatal stab wounds was just bizarrely calm. She told them she didn't think they were that bad. And this, right here, was the first huge red flag for investigators. Before calling 911, before doing anything to get help for her bleeding husband, Heather's first move was to take off his bloody shirt and start cleaning his wounds with a washcloth. You know, that feels a lot less like first aid and a lot more like cleaning up a crime scene. As first responders started to move through the house, that feeling that something was just terribly wrong, it only got stronger. What they saw in that bedroom just did not line up with the story of a violent suicide. This was the question on everyone's mind. I mean, the bed was practically clean. There was barely any blood on the floor where Robert's body was found. For a man who supposedly bled to death from multiple stab wounds, the whole scene was just unnervingly tidy. And then there was the weapon. Heather said Robert used a steak knife, right? But there was no knife in the bedroom. Not on the floor, not in the bed, nowhere near the body. This crucial piece of evidence was just gone. The knife was eventually found, get this, exactly where it belonged, in the cutlery block, in a kitchen drawer. This is the detail that changed everything. The knife hadn't just been moved. It had been washed clean, dried, and then put away. And let's be real, a person who has just fatally stabbed themselves does not stop to do the dishes. So faced with this pile of damning evidence, Heather offered up a timeline of events. A story so strange, investigators later nicknamed it the pie defense. And it's right here that her story goes from just suspicious to completely scientifically impossible. Okay, so according to Heather, the only time Robert was alone all night was for a few minutes around 11 p.m. while she was in the kitchen warming up some pie. She suggests he must have stabbed himself then. But here's the absolute kicker. She claims that after he sustained these fatal injuries, he then calmly sat down, ate the pie, and went to bed. The first piece of hard science that just demolishes her story comes down to a single number, 3 liters. That is how much blood the medical examiner found pooled inside Robert's chest. That's more than half the blood in an average adult man, and it explains why there wasn't much blood at the scene. He'd bled out internally. The full autopsy report completely dismantled her pie defense. Robert had 3 stab wounds, 2 collapsed lungs, and a severed coronary artery. The pathologist was very clear. It would be almost impossible for someone with these kinds of catastrophic injuries to do something as simple as eat, let alone live for another 4 to 6 hours like Heather's timeline claimed. So Heather was trying to paint this picture of a happy, blissful marriage. But when investigators started talking to the other people living in that house, a very, very different and much darker reality started to come into focus. The lies were laid bare by her own son, Tyler. Heather told the police they'd only had 1 drink each that night. Tyler told them Robert drank a 5th of vodka pretty much every night. Heather insisted, "We don't argue." But Tyler revealed that just 2 weeks earlier, his mom had gotten angry and actually hit him. And Heather's claim of a quiet, peaceful home? Well, that was contradicted by a neighbor. They told police that in the early hours of that morning, they clearly heard yelling coming from the Hoser's house, from both a man and a woman. But maybe the most damning testimony came from her son again. Tyler told investigators that his mom's behavior was just
weird, and that she kept saying she felt guilty. He put it pretty bluntly to the detectives, asking, "Why would you say you feel guilty, dude, if you didn't do anything?" Now, you'd think with this mountain of suspicious evidence, it'd be an open and shut case, right? But the case went cold. Heather actually went back to her life, back to teaching school, as if nothing happened. But investigators weren't giving up. They were just waiting for the science to catch up. Justice was delayed, but it wasn't denied. For almost 5 years, the case just sat there, stalled because of huge evidence backlogs at the state crime lab. But finally, in the spring of 2025, the results came in, and the police had exactly what they needed. On April 1st, 2025, almost 5 years later, the police made their move. They waited until the final school bell rang for the day, and they arrested Heather Hoer at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. And her very first reaction upon being arrested for the murder of her husband, it wasn't, "I'm innocent." It wasn't, "What is this all about?" No. Her immediate concern was for her public image and how embarrassing it was to be arrested at work. The state made it official. Heather Hoer was charged with 2nd-degree murder for killing her husband and for tampering with physical evidence because she tried to clean up the crime scene and hide the weapon. When you look at this entire case, it really leaves you with a haunting question. Heather Hoer tried to build a defense out of a whole web of lies. Lies about her marriage, about the timeline, about the evidence itself. But in the end, that web just fell apart. It makes you wonder, just how many lies can you tell before the truth finally cuts through?